I'll tell you the tragic version is he buys into this, doesn't fix it, marries the good girl, has sex only for procreation, tries to imagine that he can do without this, and then ends up cheating on her repeatedly.
Yep. Our question today comes from Maya. She's a submissive and is seeing a dom, and they have a total power exchange dynamic. She has begun to have romantic feelings and has expressed this to him. In response, he's told her that he's unable to feel romantically towards someone in a DS dynamic. He's told her that the moment he gets romantic feelings for her, he'd be unable to dominate or humiliate her, or even raise his voice to her. Maya ponders if she'll ever find a dominant partner who can engage in BDSM play and become even more passionate as a dominant once feelings come into the picture rather than the opposite.
Wow, to me, that sounds very bizarre. It sounds very strongly like he has a pretty significant degree of like Madonna-Whore complex type issues that he needs to work through and is not really accepting himself as that, hey, this is the kind of sex I like and this is the kind of romance I like. He has something is amiss there in his mental framework.
Could you expand on what you mean by a Madonna-Whore complex?
Sure. So I think the classic version, this is a pretty classic version of it actually, where the notion of romance as somehow being, or in love being pure and almost asexual. It's a sort of Victorian notion of purity and goodness there. And motherhood is there, and marriage is there. And then there's all the dirty sex I want to have that is only done with whores and like women of ill repute, because sexuality itself is impure and dirty. And thus, I cannot engage with the same people in these ways. I fundamentally framed sexuality as deeply dirty and impure. And so the people that I'm willing to have sex with and love is pure. And then the people that I'm willing to love have to be separate, different people. And once there's any kind of crossover, then I end up with huge problems because I've framed these things very strongly and inalterably that way. But fundamentally, the notion of love as pure and sexuality as impure is a recreation of the shadow and the persona. Sure, society is perfectly happy if you love your partner and your wife and you treat her well and you whatever. Society loves that. But society's pretty uncomfortable with your sex life, broadly speaking. Even within the context of marriage where it's most comfortable, still it's not like you go around talking about it. And you certainly don't talk about all the dirty things you got up to in the bedroom, even with the socially sanctioned version of marriage, the socially sanctioned version of sex, which is marriage. Even then, you don't talk about it publicly because it is a private thing. It is in the shadow. It is not part of the public persona. And he's just incorporated that way too hard. I think that's often what's happened is his adopted society's view as his own view of sexuality as being fundamentally impure, and that error is going to poison all of his relationships going forward, as it is poisoning this one.
Right. He'll be really unable to move on. At some point in time, he'll probably meet somebody that he wants to spend the rest of his life with, because he says the minute he starts developing romantic feelings, then he can't be in a dynamic. So of course the assumption is that if he ever wants a lifelong partner, that's going to be a partner that he has romantic feelings towards. That's, I think, a fair assumption to make. Then you have a lifelong partner that you have these romantic feelings for, but then you cannot express your kinky side, your sexual side.
Correct.
What are you going to do? Right? Are you just going to ignore that part of your life? I mean, he may be thinking, well, this is just a phase and I'm going to get it out of my system and then I'll just
tell
be
you the tragic
a church-going good guy married to a good girl.
I'll tell you the tragic version is he buys into this, doesn't fix it, marries the good girl, has sex only for procreation, tries to imagine that he can do without this, and then ends up cheating on her repeatedly over and over again because he needs to go to the whore because it can't be her, right?
Right.
And
can't be the mother of her kids. His
yeah,
kids.
Exactly right. Yeah. And that purity, the purity of motherhood, the purity of love, and all these ideas where the social view has crept into his internal psyche, and he's not carved out space for his own heart. It's all society. And that is the tragedy of this story and where it goes. Now, the solution to that to some degree is to start to integrate himself and to say, hey, okay, I have these impure desires. She has these impure desires. We are not angels floating around. We are earthly creatures. And there's a quote from Spirituality of Imperfection, which I really love, is man is a god who shits. And there's this notion that there is something godlike in us. There is something beautiful and amazing and pure, but also mixed with it is this animal nature. And it's both together. And you can't leave one behind. You can't fracture your being in half and say, well, I'm only going to shit over here and then I'm going to be a god over here. No. You are all of it together all the time. And you need to bring those two halves together and mix them in. And so he's got some work to do there. And it's interesting that the archetype that I talk about here is the maiden archetype, which is the archetype concerned with purity. And it's a bit interesting that he is he's struggling with a feminine archetype. That the story of Beauty and the Beast, the story of the maiden, is this story of figuring out what to do with this undifferentiated purity. And part of the answer there is the development of desires, and the owning of desires, the admission of desires. The next step is the development of values. And so I would start to ask those questions from an archetypal standpoint is, does he have a code of honor? Does he have a true value system? And is he really able to own his desires, not as a phase? And again, that's another way that people distance themselves from their desires.
Yeah, it's just a phase.
Just a phase. And that is a way of not admitting who you really are and what you really want. And there's 1,000 versions of that. But that would be the place to start, I think, is asking him how well he's able to really own that these are his desires, this is who he is, and his value system based on those desires.
It also goes to authenticity, right? Because if he's saying, well, this is just something I do on the side, this is just a side activity, sometimes I smoke marijuana, sometimes we go to Vegas and we get crazy and wild, that is somehow not a part of who he is. And so in that sense, he's not being authentic to himself. So we talk a lot on this podcast about the idea of integration, which is we all have this shadow side, which he obviously is expressing his shadow side with this person who wrote in the question. And he's doing all these things in a DS dynamic with her, and that all seems to be working just fine. But then he doesn't bring that out into his ordinary sort of persona life and tries to merge those values with his persona life at all. He has dichotomized them completely. And integration is where you're able to, in a healthy way, recognize your shadow, live in shadow space for some amount of time in a safe container-like space, and then be able to come back to reality with some remnants of that shadow integrated into your persona.
To yourself, right? Into yourself, being.
Exactly. Right.
And yourself is the container for both the persona and the shadow, and the more of both that you can expand that self to contain and to do the right thing in the right place at the right time, not fracturing yourself into half and just not being able to combine these things at all. We talk about other things. A lot of this is spiritual. A lot of BDSM has a deep spirituality to it, and one of the essential images of spirituality is pilgrimage. And the notion of pilgrimage is that it is a journey and a return. It's not just a journey. And it's also not a journey where you come back at the same as you were before. It's a journey and then you return different. You return in some way transformed. And that notion is the essence of spirituality, and that's why BDSM has these spiritual aspects, is you are journeying into your own shadow and returning transformed. If you refuse to transform, then you're refusing the gift of the spiritual journey. You are insisting on remaining static and frozen, and ultimately that does all the spiritual traditions talk about how insisting on stasis results in death, corruption, rot. It's not dynamic. In order for something to be alive, it has to change. It has to be dynamic. It has to move.
So to answer Maya's question in the beginning, yes, you can eventually find a dominant if they have integrated their shadow, if they have
Correct.
done the shadow work, if they have accepted who they really are and have found a healthy expression of that part of them, then yes, it would be expected that if romantic feelings develop, then the intensity of that dominant inclination should actually go up, because
Correct.
you typically do want to be your most authentic self with someone who perhaps you love the most. That is actually
course.
one of the pillars of that's what it means to love someone in some sense, is that you can be your most authentic self with them. And if you're unable to do that with somebody, then are you really in love with them? Are you really, or do you really have a healthy kind of love that's sustainable for the long run if they can't see you for who you really are?
Totally. Yeah, it's a very tall order to ask somebody to be in their persona space in their intimate relationship. That's not going to be long lasting.